So the next thing I really want to touch on a little more is safety. Obviously, we've discussed PPE, face mask, you don't want to breathe anything in. But also in addition to that, you want to make sure you're working in a well ventilated area. Open a window, run some fans out that window. If you've got a air filter system, that's great. Because as the resin cures, it's still going to be letting off those VOCs, and you don't you don't want to continue breathing that in. You don't want to sit there and run around with your face mask on all day. So well ventilated room. Another very big one is back to the safety of alcohol, right? So I mentioned you can use alcohol to pop bubbles on the surface of your resin just by kind of giving it a little spray over the surface, and that'll pop a lot of your little micro bubbles on the surface of your resin. That's not going to do the whole trick, so you're going to want to come back with a heat source. Alcohol is extremely flammable, so if you're going to use alcohol in your resin at all, whether it be to pop bubbles, or a lot of people use alcohol inks, which are essentially an ink that's alcohol based. Again, alcohol is flammable, so no open flames. If you've got any alcohol in your resin, no open flames. Not a torch, not a lighter. Use your heat gun. Typically, your heat gun's not going to, I guess unless you just hold it right up there and just hold it in the same spot, it's not going to get hot enough to ignite the alcohol. So if you've got a bunch of alcohol, or even a little bit of alcohol in your resin, and you hit it with an open flame, it's probably going to burn your house down. It may very well. You don't want to risk it. So no open flames if you're using alcohol in any capacity in the resin. The next safety thing is obviously, like I said, you don't want skin contact with the uncured resin. But also, a lot of epoxy resins on the packaging will claim that it's food safe once it's cured. But there's always an asterisk of when mixed properly or something like that. The problem is that food grade inspection, whatever, that's done under laboratory circumstances. So, of course, they mixed it absolutely perfectly. Especially if you're a beginner, you might not mix it perfectly. And either way, if you read some of the ingredients in epoxy resin, I don't want that anywhere near my food, whether it's cured or not. I don't want that anywhere near my food. So if you're making a cutting board or a charcuterie tray, make it just for decoration. I would steer away from even really attempting to put your food that you're going to eat in contact with that, because there's bound to be some kind of chemicals that might leach into your food from that. I wouldn't risk it, especially prolonged contact and doing it all the time. I would not risk that. Next, we're going to move on to mixing briefly. Again, your epoxy resin is going to come in two parts. I've found that most of the time that's going to be measured by volume instead of weight. So essentially, the real important thing to remember is you want as precise measurements as you can, whether it be by weight or volume. You want your part A and part B to be as precisely mixed as possible, because if you have too much of one or the other, typically it just won't cure, or it won't cure right, or it'll cure soft or sticky. I've had some really bad resins that even when I got the ratios right, it didn't mix very good at all, and it ended up sticky and soft and pliable, and it still smelled like resin. Uh, and by the way, if you come across a resin like that, just don't use it anymore, because it's kind of useless if it won't cure right. But yeah, you want your ratios to be as perfect as you can, so your resin will actually cure. If you're off by too much, and it could just be a couple milliliters or grams if you're using weight, your resin won't cure, or it won't cure properly. So that's important. As far as knowing when it's mixed, again, it probably differs if your ratios are based on weight, but I know in particular for volume-based ratios, most resins take about 3 to 4 minutes of consistent stirring in order to be fully mixed. Now, the way you can tell is, so there's going to be bubbles either way, so don't go by the bubbles, but you'll see little streaks, and you can see that you want the resin to be pretty clear. You want it to be as clear as possible. You don't want there to be any streaks in there. And when it's not mixed thoroughly yet, you'll have like little streaks. It'll be kind of cloudy. Now it can also become cloudy if you mix too fast. But again, you'll know it's mixed when it's pretty much crystal clear. A lot of times what I'll do is, sometimes it's hard to see for sure. So I'll take a little flashlight, plop that in underneath there. And with that light shining through, you can really see any streaks that might be in there, or any cloudiness that might be in there. So again, you want to make sure it's perfectly mixed, because even if you get the ratios right, if you don't mix it thoroughly, it's not going to cure right. So as far as the actual act of mixing, what you want to do is, again, it'll take like 3 or 4 minutes or so, but you want to go kind of slow so you can avoid pulling too much air into there and creating bubbles. You're going to have bubbles either way, but the faster you mix, the more bubbles you're going to have. Obviously, the slower you mix, the longer it's going to take to mix. There's a trade-off there. But so you want to go slowly. And what you want to do, especially in the beginning, the first minute or two of the mixing, is you want to be constantly scraping the edges while you mix, and scraping up against the bottom, and then do that and get it on there and kind of scrape that off into there like that. And that just helps because sometimes you might have more of part A or part B sticking to the sides or sticking to the bottom. You want to get all that mixed up good. So slow and steady, and scrape your sides. Now, you also want to avoid any kind of water or moisture getting into your resin, because again, it won't cure right if you get too much moisture in there. And a lot of times if you have too much moisture in there, it'll cure kind of frothy or cloudy, or might not cure at all. Now, obviously, so you obviously don't want to just pour water or spray water in there. But also you want to be careful what you put in. A lot of times you might want to put additives in your resin, maybe to color it, or maybe to have, some kind of special effect in there. But you're typically going to get moisture in there when you're using colorants. So you don't want to use really anything water-based. And if you do, I believe these pigments here are probably water-based to some degree. They are specifically made for resin, so I don't think they have a whole lot of actual water in them. Most liquids are going to have some kind of water content, like acrylic paint. You can use acrylic paint to color your resin, but you want to be very careful and not put too much, because there is going to be a trade-off because the moisture content will affect the curing of your resin. So be careful with that. And so typically if you're going to add things, now like if you're adding glitter or mica powder, well, this is empty, but if you're adding glitter or mica powder, not a problem. It's it's a solid thing. There's going to be little to no moisture content in something like that. Now sand, if I have some here, sand, while it seems like sand would be perfectly dry, oftentimes, sand or salt even for that matter, but you can put salt in resin as well. They're kind of a magnet for moisture sometimes. So even ambient moisture in the air might seep into your sand. So I would use the driest sand you can. Though sometimes if you use too much sand, the moisture content will add up and you might get, the resin will cure, but it might come out a little frothy on the top, which, I mean, in most cases you could just sand that off to fix that problem. Sand it off and refinish that. So that covers additives and avoiding moisture and all that. So the next bit would be pouring and also the curing process. So you want to, again, a big thing with resin is trying to avoid bubbles because it's very prone to developing bubbles. Now some projects that might be fine. Like if you're doing like a under the sea kind of diorama thing, bubbles are fine because there's naturally bubbles in water. And if you're doing like a water effect, bubbles might be fine. There's various ways, various reasons why bubbles might be okay. But if you're trying to get like a crystal clear finish, perfectly transparent, first of all, good luck not having bubbles, because you're going to at least have little micro bubbles. And you might not see them unless you look really close, but they're there. But what we can do is try to combat the formation of bubbles. And one way, in addition to mixing slowly, is pouring slowly. Just so, if you just dump it all on there real quick, it's going to pull some air into there and you're going to get more bubbles. So yeah. Now, when it comes to pouring, also, what I like to do, say I've got a mold like this, or a coaster mold, or anything kind of with walls or something. What I tend to like to do is I'll pour my edges first, pour around the edges first. Now, not right up against the edge, because then you'll have kind of a slope thing there, which you'll already kind of get once the resin cures because it kind of shrinks away a bit. But what I'll do is typically I'll come out about 1 to 2 millimeters away from the edge, pour it there, because it will naturally spread, but because resin's got a fairly high viscosity, it'll take a little time. So I'll start on the perimeter, go around, and then I'll kind of hit the middle. And once you've covered the whole surface area that you're covering, then the resin will flow into itself very nicely, and that's where it will level out a lot quicker, a lot better. Speaking of viscosity though, so say you want to do kind of like an acrylic pouring kind of effect where you've got a lot of colors, a lot of different colored resin maybe swirling around. The thing to remember is if your resin has a really low viscosity, meaning it flows really well, it's really thin, your colors, just like in acrylic pouring or something like that, your colors are going to kind of get muddy and they're going to mix together and you may end up with just an ugly mess. So if you want really good color separation, you want to mix up your resin, get your color mixed in, and let it sit for 10, 15 minutes, depending on the typical cure time for your resin. you want it to get fairly thick. You want to get it to at least the consistency of maple syrup, maybe even a little thicker, in order to keep your color separation. Because otherwise, if you're too thin, if you're pouring too thin, your colors are going to kind of blend together. In some cases, that might look okay, but a lot of times it just ends up being a muddy, yucky mess. So thicker resin is going to give you much better color separation. And also, bubbles are always going to be a problem, as I said. Again, I kind of touched on bubble popping earlier with the materials portion. So again, you can use your heat source. You can use alcohol. I do kind of steer away from that because it's just not as efficient. You really only get the very top surface layer. And plus, if you use alcohol, again, you can't use a torch because it'll light the whole thing on fire. These are great, as I said. You can pull some of the bubbles up to the surface and then hit them with the heat source to pop them. So now I guess next we'll talk about kind of figuring out how much resin you need. And there's a couple different methods people will use. So say you have a mold here, and you want to figure out how many milliliters of resin you need in order to fill that mold. Well, unfortunately, I've never really seen a mold come in a pack where the pack tells you how many milliliters it holds, oddly enough. So some people will use rice, weirdly enough. You just fill this with rice, or you could use sand even. Though sand will kind of make a mess of your mold because it'll stick a little. You'll really have to kind of scrub to clean it out. But you can use rice. You can fill it up to the top, and then you pour that into your measuring cup, and it basically tells you the volume. The thing I don't like about rice, though, is because of the shape of it, there tends to be little gaps in between. And in a much bigger mold, that kind of adds up. So your accuracy kind of goes down. Honestly, you can use water. It's not perfectly accurate, but if you've got a mold with a lot of nooks and crannies, or like I said, a big mold where your accuracy will be a little off if you use solid objects, use some water and then fill this with water and then pour it into your measuring cup. Now, you're going to want to obviously make sure all the water is dried up and there's no moisture in there before you pour into your mold. But water, you can use water to figure out how much resin you need. So something that kind of ties into that is have a backup plan for any excess resin you might have. So say this holds 50 milliliters. Typically, to be safe, and this is a good rule, just to be on the safe side, I'm going to want to mix a little more than what I think I need, just in case. And then that way you can account for spillage, potentially, or whatever. So you want to mix up a little bit more, maybe 10. I wouldn't go more than 15 or 20 milliliters over, but you want to mix up a little more than you actually need. Now, with that is going to potentially come some waste, unless you're prepared. So what I always do when I'm doing any resin pour is I kind of think ahead. So I've got all kinds of little resin molds for little bits and pieces, that you can use on bigger projects or whatever. So like here I have this leaf mold. So it's kind of silly to mix up a bunch of resin anyway, just to make some of these leaves. So what I do is I try to kill two birds with one stone. I'll take my excess resin that I might not have used in here, and I'll have some smaller molds on hand. A lot of times, depending on what color the resin is that I'm using. If it's clear, it can be any mold because you can just put any color in there. But I'll always have some kind of extra smaller molds, and a lot of times of varying sizes. I'll always have something like that on standby so I don't have to waste any resin. So yeah, you can just pour your excess into another mold, then let that cure, and then boom, I've got some leaves for a future project. Now, say you failed to do that, say you have a project that didn't turn out quite the way you wanted, you want to scrap it. What I would do is, and even excess that's on your silicone mat or whatever, peel that off, save it. Get you a little container and save every little bit of scrap resin that you come up with. The reason for that is you can recycle it. So say I have a somewhat larger, maybe even larger than this, maybe something like this. I've got a larger mold, and it's going to use a lot of resin. I can crush up those bits of used resin and recycle them. What I can do is I can mix them in or put them in the center of my bigger resin pour project. And then that equates to me needing less resin for this project because you've got that recycled resin taking up some of the volume and it doesn't go to waste. Now, a couple drawbacks of that is, obviously, say I wanted to make this pumpkin here, I want to make it transparent. Now, obviously, if it's transparent or even just slightly transparent, you're going to see the little bits of resin in there. Now, that may be fine. If you've got all kinds of different little colors, you can coordinate by colors, and it may look fine mixed in there. It may even make it look better. You know, you've got little crushed up bits of different colors in there. But a lot of times, you know, that's not necessarily how it turns out. You might just have a bunch of random colors that don't go together. But you can use that. Say I want to color this a nice solid opaque color. Then I can just pour my resin and then put my little bits in there to take up some of the volume. And boom, I've recycled my old resin. Because resin is expensive. It's pretty expensive. So you don't want to waste any of it if you can help it. So the next thing with pouring and curing is you want to, I guess we can backtrack a little bit to touch a little more on viscosity to a degree. So say I've got this mold here and I don't want to pour it all in one go. Maybe I want to do some layers, like a layer of red, layer of green, layer of gold. But you don't want the colors to meld together at all, right? Or you want to pour in layers or something. What you want to do, now you can pour one layer, let it completely cure, and pour on top of it. The problem may be that the next layer might not adhere to the bottom layer super well. And you may get a situation where maybe it'll break off with little effort. So what I tend to do is if I'm doing something layered, I'll pour the first layer and I'll let that sit for about 4 or 5 hours, cure up for about 4 or 5 hours, to where it's not fully cured, but it's firm enough to pour the next layer without the next layer seeping into it. But it's still sticky enough and tacky enough for the next layer to adhere really well. Again, you can do all kinds of things playing around with the viscosity of resin. And again, I'll touch on that a little bit more later in the video. But moving on to the atmosphere of the room you're working in, because that does matter. What I like to do is I have this meter here mainly to measure the humidity in the room. So it's very important to not work in a room with excess humidity. Now, if the room's really dry, that's fine. That's actually ideal. But you don't want, so say this gets over 60 or so. I'm either going to want to figure out a way to dry the room out, or I'm just not going to pour in that room at all. Because again, moisture content in the air will affect the not only the rate at which your resin cures, but it'll kind of affect the quality of the cure if it's humid enough. So if you're in a room of like 80 or 90% humidity, don't pour resin in that room, and don't let it sit and cure in there, because chances are it's not going to cure right. And even if it does, it's going to take forever, probably even twice the amount of time that it normally would. It's going to take forever to cure, because moisture really does screw up epoxy resin.